And so let's go ahead and take a look at an example of expected value, variance, and standard deviation. A simple example, has no context, right? These are just numbers. And we're going to use these formulas to calculate those values for us. So here's a distribution, x, your x values, a random variable, your probabilities of that value occurring. Again, there's no context here. And you can see it's just the x times the probability, x times the probability, add them up, and you get 19. That would be what we call the expected value, right? Again, in terms of really, it's just the average of these values. When these are, even though we know 19 is not, that can't happen, these are the only outcomes, we will see kind of what we say expected value, and we'll apply to some concepts. But again, this is just the skills of doing it. The variation, you saw we had that formula here. Once we get there, there we go, the variation here. You would see it's your x value minus the expected value squared times the probability. So very similar. The only difference is you're comparing it to the expected value, like the mean, subtracting it from the mean subtracted from that squared times the probability, you get 49, and then the standard deviation is just the square root of that. So that's what we're looking at there. Now I want to show you how to do this on StatCrunch. Right now, again, it may be just do all this by hand, and many times I suggest you just do this by hand. But let's go ahead and do this one on StatCrunch, how to calculate these values here using StatCrunch for a random variable. And so now that the data is in, I label them, and you put the data in from our sheet. What you're going to do here is use what's called a custom calculator. The values are in the y in this case. Many times you'll see x and p of x. The weights or your probabilities are in p of y, and just compute, and that's it. And there's your mean and your standard deviation. That's that simple. What you do with StatCrunch. Art of Stat doesn't have that ability to do this distribution. You would have to do that by hand using a calculator. But we saw, I won't ask you to do big values like that giant ones, but you would have to do what we did on the problem previously by hand to get it. And so in this case here, StatCrunch gives you these two numbers, and then we know the variance is the square of that, so you get 7.36. Again, that's the relationship between standard deviation and variance. We use those again later on, but those are two important ideas of how spread out. But we would expect out of this data, the expected value is 4.8. Let's try to look at some applications of this so we have a better idea of why we would be using expected value, even though you could see those numbers are not part of the actual data. So it's important to keep that in mind here. So here's an example. The probability distribution one, it is because you have quantitative values, and this all adds up to 7, 9, 10 to 100%. The variable is the number of cars sold during the first hour of business on a Friday. And these values would represent how often that occurs. So on Fridays, let's say over a certain amount of time, 30% of the time 0 were sold. 40% of the time 1 car was sold. 20% of the time 2 cars were sold. And 10% of the time 3 cars are sold. And so what you would do is, it is a probability distribution based on our conditions. You would use we would use a calculator to calculate that. And so what we have here is, well, we can use our, if we're going to do it by hand, right? If you're going to do this by hand, here's the values you would be putting, right? It'd be 0 times your 0.3 plus 1 times 0.4 plus 2 times 0.2, and then of course 3 times 0.1. So think about what this value would mean, though, the interpret. And so once you get this number, what this means is you get 1.1. over many Fridays, right, over and over, the number of cars sold in the first hour will be will average 1.1 cars. That's the expected value. So in any given Friday for the first hour, someone can say it's going to be between something around 1.1, right? It's not one of these, but again, on average, we get a sense, right? It's greater than 1, but not close to 2, closer to 1 than 0. So they can expect to sell at least one car, right? That would be the idea. If you're going to calculate the standard deviation, you would have to then do that by hand. This is acting up a little bit. You would do that by hand here, similar to what we had to do here by doing that calculation. And after you get the standard deviation at the variance, you would then take the square root. Once you got the variance, you would take the square root of that. And when you do that, you should get 0.943. The other way, of course, again, is to put this into StatCrunch 0, 1, 2, 3, and then do the same thing that I talked about here, where you would use the custom calculator to get it. But those are the answers you would be getting there. And then the last example here for us is well, let's stop there. I'll come back.